Well, Vivaldi's Four Seasons is, probably one of the most instantly recognizable piece in the world. I mean, it's hardly a lift or a hotel lobby that you can't hear it being played. Adverts on TV, everyone recognizes that music, even if they don't know exactly what it is. But of course, it wasn't a piece that was written out of context. And I like to think, when I go into someone's house, I'm actually quite nosy often, and I go and look at their bookshelves and see what books they have on their shelves, because it seems to me you learn a lot. And the same thing, if you imagine the 18th century, if you had a playlist, what would have been on Vivaldi's playlist? What was the music that he grew up listening to and, of course, performing? I mean, he was a brilliant violinist as well. What were the things in Venice that were going on immediately before, and who were the people he looked to and said, I love that piece, I'd love to use a bit of that idea in the next piece. And a lot of this music is not that well known. So I thought what would be a nice idea was to see where this music came from. If you like, look at Vivaldi's Four Seasons through the prism of what happened before, rather than looking backwards through a prism in terms of how influential it was and what happened afterwards. Well, the Castello is interesting because he's not only writing in a new style, but he's telling you that he's writing in a new style, which is interesting to me. It's like we are actively trying to kind of break up the rule book. And many composers have done that without necessarily telegraphing it quite so explicitly. So there's kind of an effort to actually say the old rules are old, and now basically we can do something completely different. And in a way, it sort of is, it encapsulates what the early music movement has been trying to do, in that we shouldn't really be talking about old and new, because really every time, if we're in the business of performing music that's 250 years old and more, we should be playing it as though it's just been written yesterday. And that's true of any piece that we play, really, but we kind of forget that. There's a kind of feeling that we're looking backwards by playing this music. But particularly if you're doing live music making, you're not making a recording, you're trying to recreate the excitement that these pieces had. And of course that's never quite possible, because of course you really need an authentic audience for that, people who will react in a different way perhaps to what we do today. But still, I think even a piece like The Four Seasons, to me, is not an old piece. And one of the reasons why it's so popular, I think, is it's just so amazingly vivid that even though you and I have played it a million times, I come to it every time and I just smile. It's just so brilliantly written. I mean, who else? Vivaldi writes individual bird songs into this thing. I mean, the next person to do that was Messiaen. It's so ahead of its time. Who else writes music with shepherds yawning, dogs barking, skaters falling through the ice? Nowadays, if you did that, you'd have a modern symphony orchestra with the wealth of percussion and all these fantastic colours we can find. Vivaldi does that just with a string orchestra. I mean, it is so contemporary in my view, and that's why it endures. Well, Nadia and I arrived at the orchestra at exactly the same time, and neither of us had really worked much with the group. So we were kind of the outsiders, and outsiders coming into a group that had a absolutely wonderful history, a very proud group, a group that had played together in a particular way for a long time, and so it was not like coming into a familiar territory. And I came from one route through the opera house. I mean, I'd played quite a lot of period music and played the harpsichord for, in fact, the English concert many years before, but hadn't been for a while. But since then, I'd been working at the Met in Munich, all sorts of places, in a slightly different milieu, if you like. Nadia, of course, grew up in East Germany, studied there modern violin. I first met her years ago as a teenage violinist in the Bayerische Staatsorchestra in Munich. And then she came to London, got the early music bug, and said, this is what I want to do. So we both came from slightly different backgrounds as well. And what I loved about her is that, again, as I was saying before, she doesn't come with an agenda. She doesn't come with a kind of strict rules about this is how it should be done. She comes completely with a fresh view on all these pieces. And sometimes some people find that quite disconcerting, because there's, even if you intellectually are open to a new idea, it's quite hard to do, particularly a piece that's well known, to even get your muscle memory to ignore what is so traditional. It would be a bit like a modern orchestra, doing Carmen, and someone saying, no, do that in tempo, do that bar in tempo, when for the last 50 years no one has ever done that bar in tempo. Even if you go, yes, it's easier to do in tempo, suddenly it becomes very difficult, because you just have this tradition, and no one really has questioned that tradition. And I think Nadia does that. Certainly having her right next to me, I relish just the fact that she is so completely on every gesture and every movement and I only have to move my head like this and I can feel she's right there. Sometimes that's quite strange for me, because I've spent much of the year working with orchestras where you put a downbeat down and you wait for something to happen and then move on, and all of a sudden it's like driving a Ferrari. You barely touch the accelerator and the car is off, and it's out of, and everyone's like scrambling to keep up. But she's a force of nature, and it's always a wild and thrilling ride.